Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shahina Simons, and I'm Chief of the Educational Opportunities Section of the Civil Rights Division here at the Department of Justice. On behalf of the Department and the U.S. Department of Education, I have the privilege of welcoming you to today's program commemorating the anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. 70 years after the Supreme Court held that separate but equal was no longer the law of the land, Brown stands as both a transformative moment in this country and as a promise yet unfulfilled. We are here because there is still so much work to do. We welcome all of you in the audience here and online, including all of our colleagues at the Department of Justice and the Department of Education, who work to uphold Brown's values and mandate every day. I want to acknowledge department leaders who are here with us today, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, as well as Acting Associate Attorney General Benjamin Meiser. Thank you so much for being with us. We are honored to be joined by distinguished speakers today who will reflect on both the meaning and the unfinished promise of Brown. We'll hear from members of the New Orleans Four, who bravely blazed trails as young girls and who continue to inspire us today. And we'll hear from young people, the heart of any movement, about their own struggles for justice in schools. To begin today's observance, we'll hear opening remarks from two leaders who, in the stewardship of their departments, have prioritized the enforcement of civil rights and the pursuit of equal justice. Attorney General Merrick B. Garland and Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona. Throughout his leadership, the Attorney General has spoken often about how ensuring equal justice under law is central to our founding charter and the mission of every employee of the Department of Justice. This belief is reflected in his abiding support of the Civil Rights Division, including our work to achieve the future promised by Brown, one where education at long last is provided to all on equal terms. Please join me in welcoming the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick B. Garland.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Shahina, for the generous introduction and for your leadership. I'm honored to welcome everyone to Justice Great Hall. Secretary Cardona, thank you very much for being here today on behalf of the Department of Education. Seventy years ago this Friday, on May 17, 1954, the United States Supreme Court unanimously concluded, quote, that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. On that day, the court ruled in favor of the more than 200 people from across the country who had joined as plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education. Those plaintiffs included parents like Mrs. Lena Carper, who believed her 10-year-old daughter deserved better than to have to walk and wait in the wind, rain, snow, and mud to catch the bus that would take her to the school designated for black children. And they included students like 16-year-old Barbara Johns, who led hundreds of fellow students in a strike to protest the terrible conditions at her segregated school. Barbara received death threats, her family home was burned to the ground, and a cross was burned on the grounds of her high school by white supremacists. For those students and for our country, the decision in Brown represented a promise that this would be a nation where students of all races, and backgrounds could learn together in the same classrooms and the same schools, and a promise that our schools would not only teach students about the principle that underlies our democracy, that we are all equal under the law, but that they would embody it. But in the wake of the court's decision, it became clear that the words of the justices would not be sufficient to ensure the integration of our nation's schools. As members of Congress urged states to, quote, resist forced integration by any lawful means, and governors barred schoolhouse doors, the task primarily fell to Black children. Some no more than 5 or 6 years old, whose only wish was to go to school. Among those students were 3 6-year-old girls who, together with Ruby Bridges, would later become part of the group known as the New Orleans Four. In November of 1963, 3 members of the New Orleans Four integrated the previously all-white McDonough 19 Elementary School in New Orleans. Each day, U.S. Marshals escorted them to school. On their way, they had to face down the mobs of white residents who lined the streets to heckle, threaten, and harass them. On the girls' very first day of school, parents of their white classmates removed their children from the school rather than have them sit in the same classrooms with their Black peers. And throughout their childhood, they faced years of abuse and harassment from students and teachers in the integrated schools they attended. Other students hit them, spit on them, and ripped their clothes. Those girls experienced things that no child should ever have to go through. As children, they demonstrated unimaginable bravery, and they have continued to do so as adults. Today, we are deeply honored that 3 of the 4 members of the New Orleans Four, Leona Tate, Gail Etienne, and Tessie Prevost, are participating in this program. Ms. Tate and Ms. Etienne are here today with us in person. Thank you does not feel like adequate recognition. But I want you to know that the Justice Department and our country are deeply grateful to each of you for your courage and your continued advocacy. The court's decision in Brown made clear that the responsibility of this department to uphold the rule of law and to adhere to the Constitution means protecting the right of every child, regardless of the color of their skin, to access equal educational opportunities. As we have worked to fulfill that charge for the past 70 years, the Justice Department's lawyers and law enforcement agents have been proud to stand alongside brave students like the New Orleans Four and their families. Earlier this year, the U.S. Marshal Service brought Ms. Tate, Ms. Etienne, and Ms. Provost together with one of the deputy marshals who was assigned to their protective detail, former Deputy Marshal Herschel Garner. In 1960, just 6 months into his time as deputy marshal, Mr. Garner was part of the U.S. Marshals detail that escorted them to their new school. Just 2 years later, Mr. Garner served as one of the 127 deputy U.S. Marshals who protected James Meredith as he sought to enroll as the first Black student at the University of Mississippi. This department is indebted to Deputy Marshal Garner and to the many others from the U.S. Marshal Service who risked their lives to enforce the protections guaranteed by Brown. We are also indebted to Franz Marshall, who for over 5 decades has served in the Civil Rights Division and helped lead the Justice Department's work to fulfill the promise of Brown. Over the course of his career, Franz has represented the United States in hundreds of desegregation cases. He has shaped the legal landscape, cleared paths to a better life for countless students, and given voice to children and parents in communities throughout the United States. No lawyer at the Justice Department has done more to open the schoolhouse doors to all children and to fulfill the promise of Brown than Franz Marshall. Franz, it is an honor to work alongside you. We are deeply grateful for your leadership and your continued service. Franz's career at the Justice Department and the participation of Ms. Tate, Ms. Etienne, and Ms. Provost in today's program reminds us that the work of Brown is not just part of our history, it is ongoing, it is urgent. This work is urgent for the nearly 900,000 students in 1,500 schools across more than 130 school districts, where the Civil Rights Division is to this day monitoring the implementation of desegregation orders. This work is urgent in Madison County, Alabama, where the Justice Department, joined by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, recently secured a new consent order in a long-standing desegregation case. The order addressed findings that Black students in the district faced unnecessary barriers to participating in gifted and advanced programs, that they were subjected to racially disparate discipline, and that the district's recruitment and hiring process left several schools without a single Black faculty member. And this work is urgent in school districts around the country, from Kentucky to Utah to Vermont, where the department has entered multiple agreements to address the failures of school districts to appropriately respond to serious incidents of student-on-student race-based harassment. Those agreements have required districts to reform their policies and practices, train their personnel, and take other critical steps to ensure their schools are safe and welcoming educational environments for all students. These are just a few examples of the Justice Department's work in recent years, but we know that more needs to be done. I'm grateful to Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clarke for her leadership and for the extraordinary efforts of the Civil Rights Division to spearhead this work on behalf of the Department of Justice. And all of us at the Justice Department are grateful to our colleagues at the Department of Education for their partnership. I also want to take a moment to express my gratitude to the students and young advocates who are in the audience today, and to the other young people in attendance. You are our partners. We do this work for you, but we could not do it without you. Today, we join together to celebrate and remember the court's momentous decision in Brown and the courage of so many, including people in this room, who risked their own safety to put that decision into action. We also join together knowing that fulfilling Brown's mandate, a nation where education is, quote, a right which must be made available to all on equal terms, requires our continued work. That is work this Justice Department is doing and is proud to do alongside all of you. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for your continued partnership.
Thank you, Attorney General Garland, for your remarks and for your leadership. I'm honored now to introduce our next speaker, Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona. In leading the Department of Education, and as a lifelong educator, the Secretary has centered civil rights, equity, and expanding access to the programs and the support that students need to thrive and to succeed. He understands that tapping the full potential of this country means opening the doors of opportunity wide and unlocking the talents of each and every student. Please join me in welcoming Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Shahina. I want to thank Attorney General Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice for hosting us here today. And a big thank you to our team at the Department of Education and the Office for Civil Rights, as well as our White House Initiatives teams for the work you've done, not only for today, but you continue to do. The fact that we are taking this moment today to mark the anniversary of a Supreme Court ruling that happened 70 years ago, before most of us were born, is testament to its legacy. 70 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of educational equity for all students because of the Black families and children who dared to fight the profound injustice of inequitable funding and formal segregation in public schools. What happened in Topeka was tested in schools and communities across the country. In Little Rock, where Black teenagers faced down angry, racist mobs to enter their high school. In New Orleans, where 4 first-grade girls rode to elementary school with U.S. Marshals through throngs of protesters so they could blaze a trail. 3 of them are with us here today in this room or virtually. Again, I think it's worth re-acknowledging and welcoming Leona Tate, Gail Etienne, and Tessie Prevost with a round of applause. Look, their bravery changed this country. Brown v. Board of Education sent a message, and it set a marker for what we consider normal and acceptable. Brown versus Board and its legacy remind us of who we want to be as a nation, a place that upholds values of justice and equity as its highest ideals. Over the course of the last 70 years, we've often struggled to live up to those ideals. Black students may no longer need to be escorted to school by U.S. Marshals, and they may no longer face angry mobs on their way to school or eat at separate lunch tables. But today, we have a system where we have normalized underinvesting in schools that serve a majority Black communities. We've normalized a culture of low expectations for some students. And then we give them inadequate resources and support. Today, it's still become all too normal for some to deny the legacies of racism and segregation, or ban books that teach Black history, when we all know that Black history is American history. Research has shown that even though formalized segregation has ended, a broken status quo of de facto school segregation has not only persisted, but has actually gotten worse over the last 30 years, especially in our largest school districts. This isn't just between Black and white students. Hispanic and Asian students are also attending more segregated schools. Students today are less likely to learn alongside students who don't look and think like them, who come from different backgrounds and different faiths. And they found that this can't only be explained by housing segregation or demographic changes. It's also the painful result of choices made in our courts and by our local leaders, choices that make it easy to slowly slide back. As we said in the back, that means we've got a lot of work to do. But it also means that we can do it, because we can make new, better choices. As educators and advocates, we embrace the charge to not simply guard the progress we've made, but push it forward. We can't take progress for granted. Continued progress takes bold leadership and the will to fight for change. You know, I've been to Selma and walked the Edmund Pettus Bridge along with Merrick Garland. I've been to Little Rock Central High School last year and kicked off my annual back-to-school bus tour in Topeka. I've listened to students there talk proudly about their history and civil rights legacy, and I'm in awe. But you know what inspires me just as much? Being a part of an administration that's raising the bar when it comes to funding schools equitably. That's attracting, developing, and supporting a diverse educator workforce. That's putting federal dollars into schools and districts across the country that develop programs aimed at fostering diverse school, unapologetically and intentionally. I'm proud to lead an agency responsible for enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, where our team upholds these highest values of equality of education through the law. Brown versus Board of Education helped make our work possible. It's an awesome responsibility we take seriously, but we don't do it alone. We do it with all of you. We commemorate anniversaries not just to reminisce, but to reaffirm. So I'm asking all of you today to mark this occasion by reaffirming your commitment to progress, to resisting a normal that's anything less than high-quality education for all of our nation's students. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General Garland and Secretary Cardona, for those powerful remarks and for that call to action. I want to thank the Attorney General, the Secretary, Deputy Attorney General Monaco, and Acting Associate Attorney General Miser for coming to this event. As you can see, they are off to the next stops in their busy days, but we very much appreciate them making time for today's event. To build on the reflections offered by the Attorney General and the Secretary, I'm pleased to turn the program over to my colleague, Jonathan Newton, Deputy Chief of the Educational Opportunities Section. Jonathan will moderate a conversation among 3 civil rights leaders whose life's work has been to challenge injustice and inequality. Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clark, Assistant Secretary for the Office for Civil Rights, Catherine Lehman, and President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Janae Nelson. Jonathan, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Shahina. Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to start with a few introductions. Kristen Clark is the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she serves as the department's, where she leads the department's broad federal civil rights enforcement efforts. She is a lifelong civil rights lawyer who has spent her entire career in public service and has led and contributed to efforts to address some of our nation's most complex racial justice and civil rights challenges. Thank you. Catherine Lehman is the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, where she serves as the Chief Civil Rights Enforcer in the nation's schools. She has served as Deputy Assistant to President Biden for Racial Justice and Equity, chaired the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, served in California Governor Gavin Newsom's cabinet as Legal Affairs Secretary, and was also Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights during the Obama-Biden administration. Janai Nelson is president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the nation's premier civil rights law organization, fighting for racial justice and equality, where she guides the advocacy, growth, and operation of the 80-plus-year-old legacy institution as its principal thought leader and strategist. Ms. Nelson previously served as the Legal Defense Fund's Associate Director Counsel, is a former law professor, and a recognized scholar and commentator on civil rights, constitutional law, voting rights, and comparative election law and democracy. I want to thank you again all for being here today for this important conversation. This first question is for all of our guests. As Attorney General Garland and Secretary Cardona just eloquently described, the Brown decision had an immense effect on the education of students in the United States that continues to reverberate today. And Brown's legacy is even clearer when contextualized within the individual stories of those who reaped the benefits of and then continue to fight for that change. You are all here today as highly accomplished leaders representing essential civil rights institutions. As each of you reflects on your parents' generation and your individual stories, how did the reverberations of the Brown decision affect your own access to equal educational opportunities, and what does the Brown decision mean to you? Assistant Attorney General Clark.
Thank you. First, let me just say welcome. It is so wonderful to have this opportunity to lift up and celebrate Brown with all of you, and really looking forward to this discussion with my colleagues Catherine Lehman and Janai Nelson. So Brown's impact on me is a deeply personal one. My parents immigrated to this country from Jamaica. Shortly before I was born in the 1970s. I went through the public school system from K to 8. And you know, they came here in search of opportunity to the kinds of things that they didn't have access to in the Caribbean. And good schooling you know, was really important to them. They wanted their kids to have the chance to go to schools that would open up doors to opportunities that they did not have. In my public school in the East New York section of Brooklyn, New York, you know, I attended schools that were primarily Black and brown, lots of immigrant students. And inside the schools, you could see the work that still needed to be done. You could see that Black and brown kids didn't have access to gifted track programs in the ways that others did. You could see that Black and brown students were disciplined harshly. So it was a reminder about the ongoing work that we've got to do to really ensure equity and equal access to opportunity for all students. Fast forward to high school, I went to a boarding school in Connecticut, which was a dramatically different setting than the one I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. But I had another encounter with Brown that proved profound. My junior year of high school, I had a social studies teacher who took all of us by van to Hartford, Connecticut, where we got to sit in on a school desegregation case about ongoing modern-day racial segregation that persists in the Hartford school system. And that moment was my first opportunity to be in a courtroom, the first chance to see civil rights lawyers at work, and an opportunity that really drove home for me how critically important cases like Brown are to our country. It was a moment that sparked for me an interest in becoming a civil rights lawyer, and here I am today. So Brown has had an absolutely profound impact on my life.
I'll start with my mom also. My mom was 10 years old the year that Brown versus Board of Education was decided, and she was attending racially segregated schools in Richmond, Virginia. before and after Brown. The decision did not change the circumstances of her schooling, because the whole time that she was in school, those schools never integrated. But it did change what she believed about her worth, and having the United States Supreme Court use the beautiful words to say that the circumstances of her life were unconstitutional and that she should expect more, gave her hope, gave her a belief in what could be. And she shared that with me my whole childhood. And as you talked about having seen lawyers in action, thinking about what they could do, I didn't grow up with any lawyers in my family, but Oliver Hill, who was one of the Brown lawyers, was a family friend for my mom, and he used to drive her to school. And she talked about what it meant to see someone stand for community, and to see someone stand for her, and to know that he was litigating that case because what was his son's life experience, what was my mother's life experience, was wrong. And we should expect more, we should insist on more, and we could acquire more using legal skills, is one of the reasons I became a lawyer. And in my own life, I started out in Florida at the beginning of schooling. My brother was the first black student to integrate a white flight school in Florida. I was its second, and that was 1975 and 1976. When we then moved to California, the schools I attended in California, this is not the widely understood trajectory of our country, but the schools I attended in California were integrated by court order. So all the way through my schooling, the promise of Brown was the experience of education for me. Certainly much better than for my mother, but not still what my mother had hoped, what Oliver Hill, the other Brown lawyers, had hoped would be the experience all those years later. And that notion of what could be, that notion of what isn't, and the belief that if we use the law to achieve our nation's promise is why I became a lawyer and is why I lead the Office for Civil Rights and the 600 people in the Office for Civil Rights to make sure that schools are better today than they were for me, than they were for my mom, and that we actually live what Brown promised for all of us.
So first, I want to say thank you for having me. It's a true honor to be here at the Department of Justice, along with the Department of Education, to talk about the case that the Legal Defense Fund litigated and won 70 years ago, Brown versus Board of Education. So Brown means so much to me, both personally and as the leader of the organization. Hello, there we go, that litigated Brown. What I hear in the stories that were shared by my colleagues here is something that I always try to underscore, and that is that segregation was not limited to the South. That education inequity is something that pervaded and continues to pervade our country. And my experience in New York as well was no different. It wasn't very much different from my parents, both of whom went to school in New York City and went to schools that were, I wouldn't say fully segregated, but weren't as integrated as they should have been. And much of that is a result of racial residential segregation, the way in which our cities and towns across the country are segregated by race. Some of that is by virtue of legal practice, and some of that is just the residue of redlining and other practices that are not as visible. And so my parents' experience, they went to schools that educated them well enough, but not as well as they probably should have. And so that inspired, particularly in my mother, the desire to make sure that we got the very best education. I grew up in public housing, and our local school was a hyper-segregated one that was extraordinarily underperforming. And there were tracts of students, the very few white students who did go to that school were tracked in different classes. And so another point that I think it's always important to remember is that segregation isn't just between schools, it happens within schools. That students are segregated based on assumptions of their ability and their capacity into different classrooms, into different tracks. And so when my mother saw that happening to me in my elementary school, she did something quite daring and something that could have put her at great risk. She used the zip code of a coworker and put me into a different middle school that I was assigned to. And that created a very interesting experience for me. I went from a very black school to a very white school, an affluent one. It was still public, but it was very different. And that tells you a lot about how we fund our schools and the lack of equity there. To say it was a culture shock is an understatement, probably similar to what you experienced, Kristen. But it set me on a different track, and I frankly think that that one decision about using someone else's zip code to place me in a different school changed the trajectory of my life. I was then able to go to a specialized public high school in New York and continue on to go on to higher education, and was the first among my siblings to go to college, the only person in my family to receive a graduate degree. And that's an experience that is not a reflection of their ability or their talent, but absolutely a reflection of the opportunities that they were denied. And so it is a true honor to be able to carry the mantle from Thurgood Marshall through 7 other presidents and directors council of the Legal Defense Fund to continue to fight for the full realization of the promise of Brown today. And I'm so excited to be part of this discussion because this is truly a moment, as Secretary Cardona said, to rededicate ourselves to the project of ensuring education equity for all. Thank you.
Thank you all. I want to pivot our discussion now to talk about some of the work that has been done to implement the Brown decision, and I have some individual questions for each of you. So, Assistant Secretary Lehman, after the Brown decision and the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights and its predecessor agency was equipped with important tools to combat segregation in public schools. What was the Office for Civil Rights' institutional role in helping to desegregate public schools in those first few decades after Brown? And how does it deploy those tools now to eliminate race discrimination and promote equity in schools?
Great, thank you. So to take us on a history lesson and also to talk about what we do now, the Office for Civil Rights was created by Congress to enforce the 1964 Civil Rights Act, to enforce in schools, and to enforce those early desegregation agreements in schools. As we know, and the ugly history of this country, we had massive resistance in the South to actually integrating schools consistent with the Brown Promise, which is one reason the 1964 Civil Rights Act became law. And then we had regular resistance all throughout the country ever since Brown. And in the very earliest days, we secured agreements, we worked with schools to commit themselves to fulfill the Title VI promise. It's very frustrating to me that components of those early desegregation agreements are the same kinds of things that we see in school now. Those early desegregation agreements included commitments to end disparities in discipline of students based on race in school, included commitments to ensure equity in access to higher courses in school, and included agreements to end racial harassment in school. Those are all the core of our work in the Office for Civil Rights now, 70 years later still. Not pursuant necessarily to a desegregation agreement, but pursuant to the kinds of inequities that we still know exist for students all over the country. And so that is enormously frustrating to me. It's also, just turning to a higher note, inspiring to think about what our office did in those first years when schools were refusing to integrate, were refusing even to sign an assurance that they would fulfill the Title VI guarantee not to discriminate on the basis of race. My office withheld federal funds from 200 school districts because they wouldn't sign that assurance. And you know what they did? They signed afterwards. So the tool for federal enforcement, the only tool that we have, which is that we will withhold federal funds if you won't comply with the law, really works. We know it works. And so we also know our history has been, continues to be, resistance to having to fulfill that simple justice promise that no person will experience discrimination in school. And so we are vigilant today as we were vigilant then. We are insistent today as we were insistent then that no person, every child, has the right to expect that their school will be ready for them, will believe in them, and will support them. And I haven't been able to withhold federal funds yet from a school, either in the last administration, the Obama administration when I was here, or now, because they always cave when we tell them we will. But we are ready when we need to.
Thank you. This next question is for Assistant Attorney General Clark. Although the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division has a mandate similar to the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, we have a different toolkit to achieve our mission. In those initial decades after Brown, what was the Civil Rights Division's role in desegregating public schools? Additionally, as you reflect on the division's current work, how does the division use desegregation orders now, and what does the division do to combat race-based discrimination in schools that do not operate under desegregation orders?
Yeah, so Brown v. Board of Ed, issued by the Supreme Court in 1954, the Civil Rights Division actually doesn't come into existence until 1957. And even at that point, we were really without tools to aggressively enter the space of tackling school desegregation. It was with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that we finally got robust tools that allowed us to pursue school desegregation lawsuits and got the power to also intervene in lawsuits brought by organizations and third parties like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So 1964 is kind of a watershed moment for the Civil Rights Division in terms of really being able to ramp up the work. We started to do this work on a district-by-district basis, which is slow and protracted and really not bringing the muscle necessary to really, tackle segregation in the way that was necessary at that moment. And lawyers in the division, and Franz Marshall, I'm sure, can speak to this, started to design statewide school desegregation lawsuits that allowed the department to start to tackle these issues on a broader scale. So both through that systemic work and through intervention in third-party suits, we started to make some headway here. Today, the work continues. Today, there are about 130 consent orders that the Civil Rights Division continues to actively monitor and work to ensure that school districts are complying with. Those consent orders reach several hundred school districts and nearly 900,000 students across the country today. That is how we are working to breathe life into Brown versus Board of Education, but there are certainly there is other work that we are doing to address, for example, issues when it comes to equitable access to gifted and talented programs, work that we're doing to address some of the racial disparities that we see when it comes to the ways in which students are subject to discipline, work that we are doing to tackle racial harassment of students along lines of race and more.
Thank you. Ms. Nelson, of course, there would not have been a Brown decision without the NAACP, the lawyers who went on to launch the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the hard work of Justice Thurgood Marshall, Judge Robert Carter, Judge Constance Baker Motley, Jack Greenberg, and so many others. In what ways did the Legal Defense Fund confront massive resistance in the decades right after the Brown decision? And how does the Legal Defense Fund currently advocate for equal access to educational opportunities in schools?
So I believe it was Attorney General Garland who mentioned that the Legal Defense Fund and the Department of Justice share a large docket of about 200 desegregation cases that stem from Brown. So we are still litigating the cases that Brown brought into existence by virtue of encouraging families and students across the country to challenge segregation in their districts. So that's one way in which the Legal Defense Fund is continuing to build on Brown's legacy, and that is to not leave unfinished those cases that exist and to use them to address not only persistent segregation, but other issues that plague our public education system. So it's an entry point for us to address many of the issues that continue to create inequities in education. And the way in which we confronted massive resistance was to continue some of the strategies that we brought to Brown that were quite important. One was ensuring that we buttressed the families that were willing to be brave enough to put their lives and their livelihoods on the line with community organizing. We had a wonderful organizer on our staff at the time of Brown by the name of June Shagaloff, who helped to organize communities throughout the South so that when they were willing to be bold and brave enough and courageous enough to step into the battleground of desegregation, that they also could rely on broad community support. There were NAACP chapters, there were churches and community groups that were prepared to help support and advance the work of these families and plaintiffs. We also relied a lot on social science research, which is something that we, those of us who litigate in here, know is, not all that strange to litigation now, but was quite different back then. Doctors Kenneth and Mamie Clark conducted what many of you know as the doll study. You probably all have seen the very heart-rending pictures of a black child pointing to a white child as the emblem of what's good and what's nice and what's great in this world, and not to the image of the child that is their own reflection. And that was something that these social science researchers captured and that we used in the Brown litigation to expose the detrimental harm to black children that segregation visited upon them, but also the harm that segregation visited upon white children as well, the psychological harm of the false sense of superiority. So bringing that type of research into the trial, into the advocacy, is something that we continue to use in the face of massive resistance. And we say massive resistance, quite casually, but it was such a coordinated effort. You had a governor of Virginia within minutes of the decision say that they were going to defy a Supreme Court order. You had a Senator Byrd come up with the Southern Manifesto, which was ultimately, a sign-on for states to say that they were going to resist a Supreme Court decision, and they did. And they did. So this was truly lawlessness by elected officials that had to be met with the same counteractive force of the power of law through people who were trying to advance justice in the courts. And those were the lawyers of the Legal Defense Fund and the NAACP and the brave families and children who were willing to push back.
Thank you. I want to conclude our discussion today with just one more question for all of you. Today we're recognizing and celebrating 70 years of hard-fought progress since the Supreme Court issued the Brown decision, but we're also very much understanding that there's much work ahead. Based on what you see and experience in your daily work across the country, what does the Brown decision mean today? And does the decision's goal of creating diverse classrooms where all students can learn and grow still matter? Ms. Nelson, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'm happy to start. Yes, that's a short answer, yes. Brown absolutely continues to be relevant and frankly essential to holding the core of who we are as Americans. And this room, this integrated room that I'm looking at right now would not exist but for Brown. And so recognizing that, and it's easy to lose sight of that nearly 3 generations later, but if you look at, these beautiful women here on the stage who are people who were integrating schools in the aftermath of Brown, we can see that Brown is not that much in our distant past. It is alive and well. The legacy of Brown is with us, and it's something that we must continue to honor and fight for. And so when I look at the work that we're doing in jurisdictions across the country, not just in K through 12, which is foundational and critical, but also in the affirmative action space, along with many of our civil rights colleagues like the Lawyers Committees and others, that work is an extension of Brown. Ensuring access to higher education is part of fulfilling Brown's promise. And even though the Supreme Court cut off a very critical tool, race-conscious admissions in higher education, in the wide way in which it's typically used, we can't give up the fight of recognizing that race is still a critical means of creating equity in this country. And so that's something that we are pursuing on a number of levels, both in the education space and beyond.
Thank you. Assistant Secretary Lehman.
And I will echo the emphatic yes about how much Brown matters, and I think build on the same principle of hope. Just to say, 70 years ago, when the lawyers were litigating Brown, when the families put their lives on the line to create the decision that is our gift still today, they had no reason to expect that that court was going to rule in their favor. They had no reason to hope as they did for achieving the result that they did. And I hope a take-home for us is to hope harder, is to hold on to that hope, to insist that there is a path, we can make a way out of no way, and there is a way to ensure that we actually live our national aspiration for equal justice for all. And these times are hard. These times are hard in this court. It is hard 70 years post-Brown to see the quantum of a lack of integration that we continue to see in our schools and the quantum of discrimination that we visit every day in our office, at the Office for Civil Rights. And as painful as that is, if we don't stand in the breach, it will be so much worse. If we don't use our gifts and our talent and our bravery and our insistence to push forward for more and better justice, it will be so much worse. So I hope all of us in this room will keep it up, and I commit to you that all of us at the Office for Civil Rights are keeping it up every day.
And, you know, without question, the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board of Education stands as one of the most important court rulings ever issued in our lifetime. And we take seriously our duty and obligation of ensuring that school districts are complying with its mandate. And it matters, right? Because the opportunities that we get in school shape the opportunities that we get throughout our lifetime. Access to housing, access to jobs, access to so much more. And I think about the real issues that we are still contending with today, and think about places like Utah, the Davis School District resolution that the Justice Department recently secured in Utah, where Black and Asian American students were subjected to horrific racial harassment, physical assaults that went unchecked and unaddressed by school officials. There's still so much work that we need to do to protect our kids, to protect our children. I hope that a takeaway for all of you participating today is that this administration stands committed to making sure that we breathe life into Brown versus Board of Education, that we are committed to doing everything that we can to stand up to the real challenges that students face, whether it comes to school discipline, corporal punishment, which we sadly see in school districts, racial harassment. We need a level playing field that gives every kid a fair chance. The final point I'll just say is, you know, these are tough times where we are seeing a lot of hate and bigotry in our country. And Janae Nelson mentioned the critical doll study that proved formative in the Brown litigation. And study after study since then shows that students benefit when they are in diverse learning environments in schools. They are better leaders, they are more tolerant, they are better decision makers. So we all benefit. America benefits when we have diversity in the classroom, and when we are treating all of our students equitably and fairly, and ensuring that everyone has equal access to opportunity.
Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts with us today and allowing us to benefit from your wisdom. Our next panel will be moderated by Seba Barreda. Ms. Barreda is the co-founder and chief counsel for Brown's Promise, a new initiative that works to combat racial segregation and resource inequities in schools. Ms. Barreda will lead a conversation about the Brown decision with 3 student advocates.
Good afternoon. I am so thrilled to be joined by three amazing young leaders on the stage with me today as we discuss the legacy of Brown and the work ahead. On my far left, Andrew Brennan, who just completed his first year at Columbia Law School, where he is an LDF Marshall, yeah. Where he is an LDF Marshall Motley Scholar. Andrew is also the co-founder of the Kentucky Student Voice team. Next, we have Genesis Hatchett, a scholar, singer, and songwriter, and an active member of the Real Young Prodigies, a social justice hip-hop advocacy group based in Louisville, Kentucky. And then Ava Pittman, Youth Director of Integrate NYC, a student-led organization that advocates for equity and justice in New York City schools. Ava is also a student at Metropolitan Expeditionary Learning School. So these anniversaries understandably lend themselves to a discussion of history, of law, of policy, but ultimately the question that matters most, that drives us all in this work, is the student experience that we are creating for the students of today and tomorrow. 70 years ago, Brown was more than a rejection of legal segregation. It was a promise of equal educational opportunity, of integrated, well-resourced classrooms where students from all backgrounds can learn from and with each other. As everyone in this room knows, we're a long way from realizing that vision. But that promise, Brown's promise, is still the right goal. As was mentioned in the last panel, I also came to this work from my own student experience. I grew up in Tampa, Florida, at a time when our county schools were under a court-ordered deseg plan litigated by LDF. I had the opportunity to attend some of the most prestigious, well-resourced schools in the county. That was something that my mother, who had grown up in Florida 40 years before me, was denied. It's no exaggeration to say without that opportunity, I wouldn't be sitting here today. So I know firsthand from the research and the data that we all know that the school integration brought about by Brown changed lives. But we also know that schools have rapidly resegregated in the last 30 years, and that many students do not have the opportunity to attend schools where they have access to the resources and diversity that will prepare them for the 21st century multiracial democracy in this country. So our challenge on this anniversary is to double down on making Brown's promise a reality, and to do that in a way that is more inclusive and more equitable than ever before. And no one has a more valuable perspective on how to do this than students. So I'm going to start by asking each of the three of you to answer this question. We're here today celebrating the 70th anniversary of Brown, but in many respects, many American schools are just as segregated as they were 70 years ago when the Supreme Court ruled segregated schools as unconstitutional. Why do you think American schools are still so segregated today? We'll start with Ava.
Hi, everyone. I think a lot of the times when we're talking about segregation and integration, we're easily able to identify what is happening, but it's harder to understand why it's wrong and who put these systems in place. So a lot of the times we're talking and we're returning to the same point of segregation is bad. It obviously directly impacts Black and brown students, and it's terrible. But it's who put these systems in place and why is it still happening? Why is American history still repeating itself? And I think a lot of the times we're missing that aspect in these conversations and in this discourse. And a lot of the times we want to talk about segregation, but not uplift and center youth voices. Because we see with the Brown v. Board, it was pillaged and it was brought to the forefront by youth and by students. And it's obvious that we are here because we have the most to lose in these situations. The reason why segregation is so difficult for us is because we are not given access to the same amount of resources, to the same quality of education. And if we don't have that, how are we supposed to be successful? It is literally impossible. So when we're not uplifting student voices, when we're not examining why this is happening, the systems that are putting this in place, it's really difficult for us to dismantle segregation, even though it was overturned 70 years ago. Yeah.
Hi everybody, first of all, hello everyone. I think one of the main reasons why we still see segregation today in schools is because of economic disparities. So socioeconomic factors play a significant role in school segregation today. And typically schools in low-income areas face have less funding in schools, and they face a lot of situations where there's less opportunities to get the type of education that you would want. And I think that in conversations where we talk about why we see segregation in schools today, it's really important to use real life situations and real life stories. For example, in my city, busing in schools is getting cut in underfunded schools, and that means that marginalized communities and typically Black and brown students, if they want to go out to more affluent schools and their families do not have the means to take them to and from school every day, they will not be able to attend. And I personally am a student that would be heavily affected from that. In previous years, I have attended the Youth Performing Arts School because I sing classical music. And if they had cut busing in years prior, I would not be able to attend that school, and I would have to attend my home school. That would not have given me the opportunities that Youth Performing Arts School has. And it's so important to bring in personal stories, because I think so often we kind of disassociate from the problems and separate ourselves from the problems, and we kind of put it as something we might just see on the news, or we might just hear stories about, when really every day you walk around and you see students who are being heavily affected by problems like this, like myself.
I just want, Genesis, I completely agree about the need to uplift real life stories of how segregation is playing out today. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you everyone for having us. I think the most generous reason why schools are still segregated today is complacency. Our schools are segregated because our communities are segregated, our social circles are segregated, and it's not just by race, as Genesis pointed out, it's also by class and by income. In Kentucky, we travel around the state hosting roundtable discussions with students and town hall discussions with communities to talk about what it means to deliver on the right that all Kentuckians have to quality and, yes, integrated education. And students will reflect on their own experiences with segregated schools today. For example, in Kentucky, we have school districts that are independent school districts that sit within counties, where you have neighbors attending vastly different school systems. You'll have students attending the county school wondering, why is it that the independent school that's right down the street has full-time school nurses, full-time school guidance counselors, AP classes and sports that our school has never had, and that it's not even part of the discussion. And these are neighbors that have grown up next to each other and are wondering, why is it that there's such resource disparity between our schools? You have students like Genesis who attend magnet schools across the city of Louisville who have participated in this busing program that's now preparing to be cut, sending backwards the effort in Louisville to integrate our schools, even as our residential communities continue to be segregated. And you have Black students attending schools that are majority white, being asked, why is it that they're acting white? Because they get good grades in school. They're called Oreos because the idea being that they're Black on the outside but white on the inside because of the way they dress or the way they talk. That's actually my experience attending school in Kentucky as a high school student. And so just there's such a need to be bridging the gap between how white students of color are experiencing education. It's not just to benefit the students of color. The white students need it too.
Thank you so much. And thank you for really lifting up the importance of particular student experiences, because we, as I said at the beginning of this, we need to be centering that as we talk about this issue. Andrew, you co-founded Kentucky Student Voice, the Kentucky Student Voice team. What advice would you share with students who are looking to mobilize to promote desegregation in their school systems? And what can adults do to support them in that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, Attorney General earlier mentioned some of the work that the Department of Justice has done in Kentucky. And I did want to share just the story of two students, Mariah and Macy Hill, from Madison County, Kentucky, who were the subject of a recent settlement with the Department of Justice. You know, these two young women experienced massive amounts of harassment, discrimination. Their teachers were making fun of black community leaders. They were sent hate mail that described the N-word 300 times. It was scrawled into their lockers. Their classmates were wearing racially hostile imagery on their hats and on their clothes. They would repeatedly go to the principal. They would bring the anti-discrimination policy, but they were rebuffed. Their complaints were ignored. And the Department of Justice had to step in. And one of the things I appreciate, well, actually two. So first of all, when Mariah and Macy Hill went to the superintendent, they win a lawsuit against the school district. They didn't wait to ask for permission from adults to sue the school district. They didn't wait for their 18th birthday to take action in contacting the Justice Department. They took action to address injustice in their community because it was the right thing to do, because they knew it was necessary. The other thing I wanted to mention, though, is that the Department of Justice used the results of these school climate surveys to help underscore some of the experiences that students were facing. Now, in Kentucky, like in many states, these school climate surveys are mandated by the state. Every student has to take them. Many students never even see the results of these surveys. Many students don't take them very seriously. And so what I want to say to students who are experiencing racially hostile environments at school, take these school climate surveys seriously. The Department of Justice is watching. Folks like the Kentucky Student Voice team are watching, and that data is critical to shine a light on the experiences that not just you are having, but that black students are having across the school and across the school districts as they continue to be segregated.
Thank you. Ava, you are part of Integrate NYC, which is a youth-led organization that focuses on desegregation in New York City schools. Based on your experiences with Integrate NYC and your own school experiences, what do you wish people knew about what school segregation looks like in 2024? And what is your organization doing to address modern day school segregation?
So I live in New York, and I live in an inner city neighborhood, and my school is an hour and 20-minute bus ride. It's majority white. It's in a majority white neighborhood, and I've been going there since the 6th grade. So I think that understanding, like when I'm on the bus and I see the neighborhoods transforming and I see it look better but also look whiter, for me it's been like it's been hard to not feel like a sellout, to go to a better school that offers more resources, but also to leave like my black peers behind because I don't want to go to a zone school. And I think that joining Integrate NYC has let me put my frustration somewhere, because integration isn't always like an applicable and understandable process or idea until you're sat down and you're explained the history. And I think that in the opening remarks, we're talking about like black history is American history. The history of segregation, the history of the civil rights movement is primitive to American history. So I think that having to go to a school that's like fairly liberal and progressive, but still ignorant to the fact that like there's not a lot of black students, so black history is only important during a specific month or during the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board. You know, we are put in these spaces where we're tokenized, and if we're talking about integration, tokenization needs to be dismantled, because you cannot, like, integrating bodies is just as important as integrating identities and understandings and learning. So I'm a part of NYC, Integrate NYC. I joined last year, and we launched this new campaign. It's called Schools Bias for Us, and it's basically talking about if we want true integration in New York City public schools, students have to be the voice of it, and we need to be controlling what happens. So there's a lot of education councils inside New York City that dictates what happens to schools, specifically what happens to students, how we're treated, and how we're able to coexist inside these institutions. Students, a lot of the times, can be on these boards, but they have no voting power. So obviously, that doesn't make any sense, and it's really stupid. So in order for this campaign to be successful, in order for students to have real voice, in order for integration to be successful, they need to be able to sit on these education councils, have voting power, and have a voice. And obviously, adult allies exist, but the people that are pushing for this movement, the people that are pushing for integration, are youth that are directly impacted by it. So I think that Integrate NYC is doing a lot of work. I think it's also important for individuals to be doing work inside themselves, because there's a lot of bias that we have that needs to be checked. Because stigma often leads to segregation without you even knowing. So I think that if we check our biases and also visit Integrate NYC's Instagram to learn more about the campaign, we can understand why segregation is so important and why it needs to be dismantled. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know Integrate NYC has done a lot of work on this idea of what real integration looks like in schools. I think the
5 R's.
Or the 5 R's. Could you just quickly go over those for us?
Okay, yeah. So the 5 R's are basically like the founding principles of Integrate NYC. It was created by the founding youth that are now on to like larger things. A lot of them are in like criminal justice and law. So one of the 5 R's is representation. It's really important to have students that see themselves not only in the curriculum, but the people that are teaching them. Another one is resources. So a lot of the time, a majority Black and brown schools will lack resources. They won't have AP classes, they won't have sports teams. A lot of the times, the things that specialized high schools get or like funnel high schools get, we're not allowed to have, or we're not even allowed to think of, honestly, because it's just like we're the constant fight against so many things and so many systems. You're lucky to be in school, or you're lucky to like go to a college, and it's stigmatized to want more, which I hate a lot. Another R is restorative justice. So a lot of the times where in these spaces and will be wrongly persecuted. So if a student is acting out, we're not asking why, we're just going straight to penalization and punishment, and obviously that should never, ever, ever happen. Another R is relationships. So obviously, very similar to resources, we need to understand that in order to have integration, in order to dismantle segregation, you need to trust the people around you. More specifically, you need to trust the adults that are in your space. So there's no way that you're going to be fighting alongside an adult ally if there's not trust, if there's not a relationship being built. So yeah, the 5 R's.
Thank you. Building off of that, Genesis, you work with hip-hop-based education, which seeks to bring culturally relevant teaching practices to diverse classrooms. Based on your experiences and your talents, how can music and the arts be used in schools to create more equitable learning environments?
Okay, I'm part of the organization HH Into Well, which stands for Hip Hop Into Learning, and also the advocacy hip hop group, The Real Young Prodigies. And we have a motto that says, we put lyrics to action. So that means we make music and we make songs that captivates and gets the eyes and the ears from our audiences, but then we speak on the real life issues. And I think one of our most notable things that we've done was pass the Crown Act ordinance in our city. And if you don't know, the Crown Act is an ordinance that protects Black natural hair from discrimination in the place of education and the workplace. So we passed that in our city, and thank you. And we used students to be able to advocate for that very thing. Recently, we went to the Capitol in Kentucky and we invited 400 students from all around our school district to come out and speak and advocate for themselves in unique ways that you usually wouldn't see. And I think so often when we talk about student advocacy, we put ourselves in this box as we just need to speak and we need to be so serious. But we went to the Capitol and we were singing Mooney Long songs and we were singing Can We Talk? And that's how we advocated for ourselves and that's how we got our voices heard. And can we do a little audience participation? Because I want to teach you guys the hook of our song, The Crown, song Crown. So repeat after me, please. It goes, every time I whip my hair around and round and round.
Every time I whip my hair around and round and round.
You can look, but you can't touch my crown, my crown, my crown.
You can look, but you can't touch my crown, my crown, my crown.
Now, some people may hear that and think that's silly, or they may think, how could that do anything about harmful policies? But we know that that's how you get an audience engaged, and that's how you get people to look at the problems and see them in a different view. And then I want to talk about another mission that we've recently been on. So in my city, there was a young girl named Dovia Purnell whose life was tragically taken by gun violence. She was shot in the Park Hill neighborhood, which is the neighborhood that we rehearse and that we practice and that we learn and that we educate ourselves and that we educate others, and we do a lot of community organizing there. And me and my best friend came up with a song called Journey to Eden, and would it be okay if I sang a little bit of that for you all? It goes like this. I've been traveling on this lonely road for several days. I'm trying to find the enemy, but I can't find my way. I know that there's a higher power that is guiding me. The best version of myself is what I strive to be. I can hear the inner voices coming over me. I hear demons deep inside that just won't let me be. Yet I can feel it in the air, it's my time now. Just like the moon eclipse, the sun is gonna shine now. Take me home, 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 take me home. So we created that song in honor of Dovia, and the reason why we made it is because we know that that's the unique way that we can use our voice, and that's the way that we can truly honor Dovia's legacy. And we find it very important to give students that opportunity to learn and educate others in the way that maybe the school system does not usually teach them that they can. And just whatever way that you are able to advocate for yourself is a valid way to advocate for yourself. You might not be a speaker, because in my life, I have never thought of myself as a speaker. I always thought that if I was gonna be on a stage, it was gonna be to sing classical or sing R&B or anything. I never thought I would be speaking in front of the DOJ like I am today, but here I am today, and I get to share the opportunities that I've had to sing and advocate for students that are just like me, and it's really important to have those opportunities.
Thank you so much. I really feel like we should just do mic drop and end it here, but one last question. This has been so amazing. We're so appreciative of your perspective as students, but we know student voice is often missing from important policy discussions. You are at Great Hall and DOJ. What steps do you think advocates and policymakers need to take to meaningfully include student voice and change?
Well, I really like the idea of putting voting students on school boards, so that should be happening everywhere for sure. Especially when our school boards are so overwhelmingly white and our student population is not. Ms. Clark mentioned this earlier, but the purpose of our public school system is to be incubators for our democracy.
And so if we want a democracy where our communities are integrated, where people are coming together across lines of difference, where people know how to interact with people that are different from them, then those are the kinds of skills that we need to be building in our public school system. And it cannot happen when it is racially segregated. In the state of Kentucky, students have a right to a quality education, but what does it mean to have that right when there are more suspension and expulsion events of black students in Kentucky than there are black students in the school system in the state? What does it mean when students, black students, are doing everything right, having perfect attendance, getting good grades, and then finding themselves in post-secondary institutions having to take a year of remedial courses on their own dime because they were in schools that didn't actually prepare them for college, even as they were giving them A's and B's on their report cards? And then what does it mean to be in communities where you have schools that are 90% white and communities that are 50% people of color? And I just want to underscore again, that doesn't just hurt black students. That is harmful to white students as well, and it's showing up for all of our students as what we need to do when we're trying to integrate our public schools.
Like I was just saying previously, I think it's important not to limit yourself to the box of what advocacy is. Find what you can do. It might not be speaking, it might not be singing. You might want to dance about the issues, you might want to create art about the issues, you might want to paint about the issues, but find what you can do to advocate for yourself, because it's all valid and it is all serious. You don't have to be like the person that's sitting right next to you to be able to speak on behalf of the issues that you face every day. And I also think it's very important that we have the uncomfortable conversations. I go to a predominantly white institution, and I know that personally it can be really, really hard to do things like this because you never know what the reaction of your peers are going to be, especially if you're in a PWI or even around your black peers. You never know how they're going to react. But it's so important that if you truly want to advocate for yourself, then you have those conversations. And it does not matter how young you are. 2 days ago, I was at my senior prom, and today I'm here speaking in front of the DOJ. It does not matter how old or young you are, and also I think it's important that you create space for other people to be able to share their stories and to speak on behalf of themselves.
I think it's crucial to understand that the Supreme Court found that segregation was unconstitutional, and less than 70 years later, they overturned affirmative action. So there's systems that are actively being put in place to not only dismantle black people, but to set black youth back. And that's really, 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 really important to know, because integration, we're doing this because if we want to be successful, if we want to be alive, if we want to be happy, this needs to be in place, this needs to flourish, and it needs to continue to grow. America has a really terrible habit of repeating its history of segregation, its history of white supremacists and its systems. It is crucial to note that if we want holistic integration, we need to understand that it starts with youth. We need to have spaces where we're able to speak our mind, where we're able to be ourselves without being reprimanded by an adult or by a system in place that's actively here to oppress us. And I think it's really important to note that we are sitting here as black youth being asked to talk about our blackness and the oppressive points of our blackness, and not about other aspects of our identity that are equally as important and that equally need to be shared. So I think that, like I said earlier, in order for integration to exist, we need to dismantle tokenism. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's give a huge round of applause. I'm handing it off to Ms. Simons.
Oh, that was amazing. So thank you, Saba, again, for your leadership, and thank you to Ava, Genesis, and Andrew for your advocacy and for that inspiring discussion. I think we all felt the impact and the power of your voices. I now have the privilege of inviting Ms. Leona Tate, Ms. Gail Etienne, and Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark to take center stage for the next part of our program. To help introduce them as they take their seats, I'm grateful to be joined by Damon Hewitt, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Damon has deep roots fighting for educational justice, equity, and opportunity for young people across the country. For more than a decade, he litigated school desegregation cases at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and led its education practice. Damon was one of the first LDF lawyers that I met and worked with when I joined the education section more than 10 years ago. And Damon was born and raised in New Orleans, which makes him the perfect person to introduce our honored guests. Please welcome Damon Hewitt.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Shahina, for the warm welcome, to Assistant Attorney General Clark and all of the dignitaries from the Departments of Justice and Education, and you as dignitaries in your own way, whether you work for the federal government, whether you work in sister organizations, whether you work in school, you're fighting for the same common mission. I'm so pleased to be with you today in my personal capacity and also my official capacity as president of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Over 4 years after the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown, little had changed in the American South, and that's especially true in New Orleans. As a student of history and also someone who's litigated a fair number of school desegregation cases earlier in my career, many alongside DOJ, and great to see you, Franz, and Lisa, and John Butchko, and Jim Eichner, and so many great people here. I understand that Brown v. Board did not change everything all at once. Landmark decision, but there was no easy button for desegregation, let alone integration of our schools, of our neighborhoods, of our society. The process of school desegregation, you heard earlier Kristen Clark and Catherine Lehman talk about it, was district by district. It also sometimes feels like school by school, neighborhood by neighborhood, classroom by classroom. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that federal money, resources were actually on the line. And even then, before and after then, the wheels of justice turned so slowly. We know that so long as we have had schools in this country, we have had racial discrimination in education from the very beginning. We know that education can be the great equalizer, but for so long it keeps veering towards being the chief means of social stratification between who has and who doesn't have. And it sends us the message of who belongs and who does not. Now, we know that the push for desegregation, for educational justice and opportunity came from people like Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, Oliver Hill, Pauli Murray, Jack Greenberg. But we know it also came from regular, everyday people, working people, who were not necessarily at the vanguard of civil rights leadership. You know, there's this nostalgia that people think every black person in every southern city marched. It's not true. We know that there were often small numbers of people, and some people who couldn't be active because of fear of retaliation or worse. And we know that sometimes that activism came not just from the adults, but also from children of tender years. Now, there's stories of desegregation in pretty much every city throughout the South and even some in the North and other parts of the country. Every big city and even the small hamlets. We all know many of the stories. We know about the Little Rock Nine, but today we're here to talk about and meet some of the unsung heroes of civil rights and desegregation from New Orleans. Now, the wheels of justice turned slowly in New Orleans as well. Federal Judge Skelly Wright issued a court order to gradually desegregate schools, emphasizing the deliberate and all deliberate speed. And so, on November 14th, 1960, that marked the first day of first grade, the first day of that gradual desegregation for 4 young girls, Leona Tate, Gail Etienne, both of whom are here with us today, Tessie Prevost, and of course, Ruby Bridges. Collectively known as the New Orleans Four, they blazed a path to equity in New Orleans and beyond. Now, these girls, now women, were born into a world where black children didn't even get to be children, at least not without facing the troubles of society. They faced white flight in real time because within days, if not hours, all of the white classmates were gone, pulled out of school by their parents. Instead of classmates, they had federal marshals, and their parents were on edge in fear of racialized violence. They even ended up pioneering desegregation once again at another school when they moved on to 3rd grade. So it wasn't just, again, one path, one easy button. This was a life to be lived. Their courage, their grace, their sacrifice all made possible a pathway for all of us, including me, because I'm a son, a native of New Orleans, as you heard earlier. Less than 30 years after you desegregated McDonough 19, I had a chance to attend a school that was created just 3 years before that fateful day in 1960. It was built as an elite math and science high school, the Ben Franklin High School, but it was created for white children. And so it was your sacrifice, your leadership that allowed me, less than 30 years later, to attend that school. And you heard that similar story from Janae Nelson, from our students. You heard that so often. It's because of that leadership, that sacrifice, that we have the opportunities that we have. So whenever I felt alone at that school, and I did because there were fewer than 25 black students in my class, I would think of y'all. I would think of what you went through, and what I experienced paled in comparison. But I also understood that we owed and owe you a debt, not just of our gratitudes and platitudes, but a debt of service. And that's why I dedicated my life and career to this work. I dedicated my life and career to working alongside many of you. We continue to fight, and you see that fight at the Departments of Justice and Education. You see that fight at sister organizations represented here. You see that fight at Andrew Brennan, who was one of my favorite clients. He's the client most likely to be your boss one day, because he was one of the lead plaintiffs when we litigated for 9 years and then argued the UNC affirmative action case in the Supreme Court. You continue that fight, right? It's so important. So I know that we owe you a debt, and all we can say is thank you. Those are the words. But we can also show you through our actions and continuing to work. And so we're so pleased to have in person 2 of you with us, and also Ms. Prevost, I believe, via video. We're so pleased to have you, and I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and know that I'm going to keep passing it on as so many continue to do. We love you. Thank you so much. I now yield to my good friend and colleague, Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Kristen Clarke.
Thank you so very much, Damon. I am delighted to be joined in person today by our very special guests, Ms. Gail Etienne and Ms. Leona Tate. But before we begin, I want to take just a moment to share a short greeting from Ms. Tessie Prevost, who very much wanted to be here today.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tessie Prevost. I'm honored beyond my wildest dreams to be invited by the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, and the United States Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, for this monumental moment in history, the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board. I want to thank you for including and recognizing myself and the other 3 members of the New Orleans Four, Gail Etienne, Ruby Bridges, and Leona Tate. This moment means so much to us because our contributions and commitment to equality and justice has gone unsung for decades. Unfortunately, I could not be there with you and my 2 sisters, Gail and Leona. But with God's grace, I hope you invite us back for our 60th anniversary next year. We each turned 70 years old this year. We were actually born the same year Brown versus Board overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in 1954. And 6 years later, on November 14, 1960, the New Orleans Four brought it home for our great ancestor, Homer Plessy, who was the first person of color to confront segregated spaces when he violated the Louisiana Separate Car Act on June 7, 1892. This is truly a momentous and historical occasion for us, the New Orleans Four, for our families, and really and truly for our country. It's time we recognize all of our pioneers of all colors and backgrounds whose contributions helped to shape this nation to be what it is today. Only then will we be able to come together and move this country toward its great potentials. I wish I could have been there to meet you all in person, and again, thank you so much for this recognition and the opportunity to participate in this amazing event.
Well, thank you both for being with us here today. As Attorney General Garland noted earlier today, the Brown decision itself was undeniably significant, but it was young children like you that had to give that decision meaning by claiming the equal educational opportunity that Brown promised. So today I want to give you a chance to share your testimony, your firsthand stories. I want to ask you about the changes that you've seen. I also want to ask you about the changes that you haven't seen as a result of your work. And I want to talk about the path forward. So to start, I want to ask you to each share with us what you remember about that morning when you set out for your very first day of school at McDonough 19.
I can remember it like it was yesterday. Woke up to a house full of family and friends just to be there to support my parents. And you would have thought it was a holiday because it seems like everybody had something to do. And you only see that type of stuff for Christmas or something. But I remember a black car pulling up in front of the door. And everybody seemed to be in a happy spirit before that happened. And when the car pulled up, the household got real quiet. So I knew something was about to happen. I knew I was going to a different school. I was excited about that because I hated my old school. And my mother got to the door and she said, when you get into the car, you sit to the back of the seat and do not put your face to the window. I tell a lot of children today, obedience had to play a big part in what we had to do. We had to listen. So we took the journey, which seems like 3 or 4 blocks from where we were living at that time, because McDonough 19 was in our community. And I was walking 11 blocks to get to Hardin Elementary. So getting a ride was a luxury, you know, and it would seem to be very comfortable. So we arrived on St. Claude Avenue, and all three cars pulled up at the same time, and all we could see was masses of people. I did not recognize that everybody out there were white. I did not recognize the anger at that time. Being naive and from New Orleans, I thought a parade was coming because that's what it looked like. I could see police on horseback holding a crowd back. I could hear the noise, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. So I wanted to know why I had to go to school on Mardi Gras and everybody else got to watch the parade. So Mother said, no, that's not the case. So we did get to journey inside the building, and we got in safely. Nobody could get to that side of the street where we were. The police did a very good job holding the crowd back. So we approached the office, the principal's office, and was asked to take a seat on the bench. And we must have sat there half the day before they even decided to place us in the classroom.
Hi. Hello. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having us, rather. And bear with me. My first day is different than Leona's. For some reason, I blocked out before I got to school. Knowing my father, the type of man he was, I'm pretty sure he sat down and talked to me about what was going to happen. But for some reason, I don't remember that. My day starts with me in the car already with the marshals and turning the corner to come on St. Claude Street, seeing the mobs of people saying all kinds of things, and I'm just looking out the window. I saw one lady was pregnant. I never forgot that. She had a garbage can top in her hand, and I'm wondering why she's so angry and why the crowd is so angry with me. I'm thinking, what have I done to make this crowd of people act like this towards me? I was just a 6-year-old girl going to school. And it looked like if they could get to me, they would kill me, and I didn't know why. The car pulled up in front of school. I went up the stairs with Tessie and Leona, and we went to the office, and we sat there for hours, like Leona said. It appears as though they didn't know what to do with us. So we decided to play together. We played hopscotch. We played hopscotch on the floors outside the hallway. And when they finally decided to bring us to the classroom, hours later, the white parents came in there one by one and started taking the kids out the classroom. And by the end of the day, we were the only 3 students left in the school, Tessie, Leon, and I. And we had a whole school full of teachers who had to stay there, but we were the only students left in the building. And that's how the first day went.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. It's as if it were yesterday. How did the rest of the school year go? I'm curious to hear about the things that stood out in your mind from that very first year.
The rest of us, well, we were the only 3 in the entire building for a year and a half. We had school normally in class, but we were confined to just a part of the building. As big as the building was, we were not allowed to wander around. And the classroom was papered, the windows were papered up. No one could see in, and we couldn't see out.
We created a great bond between us because it was just the 3 of us.
It was just the 3 of us.
So everything we did it together.
Well, I think we were trained to do that. We couldn't leave each other, even to go to the restroom. We had to go. But we had a great first grade teacher. She was more motherly than a teacher. We couldn't eat from the school. We brought out food and beverages. The water fountains were off.
Couldn't go to the bathroom by ourselves.
Never did. She brought us to there. Our play area was right outside of the classroom under a stairwell. So that's where our play area was. So we would eat our lunch there or eat our lunch at the desk. But school, we had class just like normal.
That's what we did the whole year.
Never allowed to go outside. And that was our only concern. We couldn't play in the yard. We couldn't play in the yard. And if you would ever visit today, you could take that tour and see exactly how it looked then. I now own that building. And it is set up, and it's going to be set up the way we entered that building.
That stairwell was our safe haven. That's where we would go at every day, just the three of us. And our teacher was close by watching us. And the federal marshals was there also. We just didn't know it. Yeah. We thought they had left us, but they never did leave us. They stayed there every day.
Do you remember the marshal's name?
Oh, yeah. Al Butler.
Oh. Herschel Walkers was Tessie's marshal, and my marshal name was Warren.
She had a nickname. What was it?
He was my boyfriend. He didn't know it, but he was my boyfriend, you know. But yeah.
Kept you safe and secure.
He did.
Yeah, he did.
He did.
They were, if they didn't want to do it, we never knew that.
We couldn't tell. We couldn't tell.
We were never afraid to ride with them alone. Never afraid.
You both went on to integrate other schools in New Orleans after McDonough in 19, but without the protection of the U.S. Marshals. So wondering if you can talk with us about what those experiences were like.
Horrible. Horrible, horrible.
We didn't face integration until third grade. We were, McDonough 19 had become a black school after the Christmas holidays in second grade. Only black students came. There was only 2 white sisters that came, but they made a decision to make it only exclusively for black students. And we were transferred to another all-white school. Now, mind you, integration progressed as we progressed the grade. New Orleans was already 6 years behind time. We were 6 years after Brown. But as we progressed the grade, it's the grade level that was integrated. You could only be in the grade we were in or lower. And that stayed that way until we reached 10th grade. Sims was horrific.
At Sims, when we got to school, the parents would line up on each side of the entrance, and we had to walk through that crowd of angry parents every day, listen to what they say about us, calling us all kind of names. I think some of them even were trying to hit us or whatever. Can't remember all that. But even the principal was ugly with us. They didn't want us at that school, and they let it be known. They didn't want us there. The students didn't want us there. The teachers didn't want us there. When we were at recess, there was this little tree outside, and that's where we all would go and just hide underneath the tree, ball up in a little bundle on the girls' side. The boys had the boys' side. But that's what we would do every day. Just get there. We didn't have a recess. That was our time to be together and just be together and feel safe amongst us.
We were definitely afraid to go to the restroom. Couldn't go in the cafeteria. Either somebody was going to knock your food out your hand or they was going to spit in it.
They treated us like animals. We didn't know it at the time. But that is exactly what they were doing. There were teachers definitely there that were encouraging them to do that to us. Call us all kind of names, spit on us, anything that you could think of that young children shouldn't go through in school, we went through. That experience, I'll never, ever forget. And talking about it, it upsets me, I'm sorry. But the more I talk about it, the better it helps me to deal with it. Because when I was 6 years old, we were at the other school, I was on nerve medicine at 6 years old. And a baby really shouldn't have to go through that, because that's what we were. But as we got older at Sims, we started fighting back the best that we could. It wasn't much, but it was us trying to stand up for ourselves. One of the worst days I had at Sims was I got hit in the stomach with a baseball bat. And nothing was done. My dad would write letters to the school. Tulane, I think it was Tulane University, found one of my daddy's letters, and they have it there at Amistad, yeah, that's correct. But nothing was done. Absolutely nothing. I just got hit in the stomach, and the day just went on. Leona had a teacher. Tell me about Miss Dunn, Leona. Oh, God.
Who was that?
She was, I think she was a 6th grade teacher. She wasn't our teacher, but she was one that would coerce the other students to do us things.
Yeah.
So when she passed us, she would either have a handkerchief or a napkin in her hand, and she would cover her nose as if we had an odor. So she would show the other kids to do us the same thing. You know, she was, I don't know, she was the meanest person I ever saw. These children were the meanest children I had ever seen in my life.
Yeah. They were told to do those things to us.
Yeah.
They really were.
How did these experiences ultimately shape your life?
For many years, we didn't talk about it. We would talk amongst we talked amongst ourselves, but it didn't seem to matter publicly. I'm not even sure how long it took me to talk about it. And,
nobody didn't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
So
it was like if you were either our age or younger, you didn't understand. So there was no sense in us trying to explain because we couldn't get across to you.
They said I did the same thing. And you try to explain to them that, no, it wasn't the same. You know, we were 6 years old when we did it, and you did it in 8th or 9th or 10th grade or whatever grade it was. You did it after we did it. Not saying that we were better than them, but trying to get them to understand that what we did was different, you know, and they just didn't get it, you know. And so, like Leona said, the only time we would talk about it was when the 3 of us got together, you know. We would get together from time to time and we would talk about it. And those were happy times for me because we were the 3 of us, we bonded and we got together and we were able to just speak our mind to one another and say all the things that we went through that nobody knew about. We didn't have a pretty story. Our story wasn't pretty.
I know.
And it's important that none of us ever forget the story and the courage that you all showed as little girls.
It was our parents.
Oh, yeah, it was the heroes. Parents. It was strictly the heroes.
They didn't know what we were going to go through. They had no idea. But my daddy made the comment that, my daddy called me Monkey. He said, Monkey, if I had known what you were going to go through, I still would have did it because it was something that needed to be done. All our parents felt that way. It was something that needed to be done.
And you got to realize it was like they only asked for families in the 9th Ward area in New Orleans. Of course, that's the local income area. And there was 140 families that applied. The criteria was so high, they only chose 5 families, but only 4 participated.
And what were some of the criteria?
Well, one little girl couldn't participate because she didn't have a 2-parent household. No boys. There were no boys.
What changes have you seen in race relations in our country from back then to now? And what changes would you like to see in the road ahead?
In schools, you know, we're back to square one. You know, just as segregated as we were before. But to me now, it doesn't make a difference as long as the children get the resources that they need, you know, and that's what I would like to see. It doesn't matter what color the person's skin is sitting next to you. If that's for you and you're getting the education that you need, that's what I want. I see a lot of toleration, just people being tolerated, and we can tell if you're just tolerating us or you're really for us, you know. We do a lot of program work of undoing racism, and hopefully we can meet some of those people again that protested against us to see where did that come from. Nobody is born with that. Nobody.
Nobody what?
Is born with that.
Oh. I actually had one little girl, when the parents or the teachers weren't looking at you, they wanted to play with us, you know, and she accidentally touched me and then made the comment, my mama told me if I touch you, I would turn black. You know, and she believed that because that's what she was taught, you know, and it just wasn't so, we didn't have a normal childhood. We really didn't. We couldn't go outside and play like everybody else did. You know, I could go around the corner to my grandmother's house and play with my cousins because it was fenced. But I really couldn't be outside playing like normal 6-year-old kids did, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. We just didn't have a normal life. And I was going to say that it took some time to realize what we had done, what effect it had on the world. You know, at that age, we didn't know what we were really doing. We were going to school. At least we were trying to go to school and get a better education, because the schools that we went to, they were falling apart. We had old raggedy books, pages torn. You know, it just wasn't the same. And my dad said that I paid my taxes just like everybody else, and we had the right to go to any school that we wanted to, especially because it was so much closer than the ones that we were going to before that day.
You all are truly heroes, and we owe you a debt of gratitude. When did the moment hit you? When did you realize the tremendous sacrifice that you made and how important it is what you did at that very young age?
We're much older.
Yeah, we were much older. I always knew something had happened in the back of my mind, but it was so overwhelming that, you know, not so much in school, outside of school. It was just overwhelming. My children didn't know for a long time, I'll be honest with you. And I think in 9th grade, my gym teacher called me in her office, and she said, I'm reading a book, and you're in it. So that made me think, maybe I did do something. But, yeah.
You all have taken the pain of what you've been through and are doing some really great work today. And I just want to give you a moment to talk about some of the work that you're leading now.
I'd like to say something first. Our story was buried in history due to a popular singular story narrative about one school and one 6-year-old girl. Author Chimamanda Adichie, if I'm pronouncing it right, said it best in her speech, that the danger of a single story narrative. Single stories can have significant negative impact. They can rob people of their dignity and dehumanize them. Sadly, single stories can also have a malicious intent to suppress other groups of peoples or individuals. So that's what happened to our contribution. It was historically negated, and the single story became the only story.
Well, we're giving you both an opportunity here to share part of your story, to make sure that we are carrying out our work and able to center the perspective and experiences that you had as we work to continue to fight racial segregation in our schools today. So thank you for being with us.
You're welcome.
If there is one thing as we close out, I want to give you a chance to just impart some final words. You have a room full of employees from the Justice Department, the Department of Education, students, advocates, lawyers. What is, I guess, one final message that you would leave for our audience?
We have to keep telling these stories, because if we don't, they will die. And our story was the school board didn't even remember what happened at McDonough 19. And we was very sentimental about that building. And after Katrina, they were only bringing one school back to the lower Ninth Ward. And McDonough 19 is in the lower Ninth Ward. So that's when I formed the foundation to try to get it open up as a school again, but they wouldn't do that. So I talking to Gail and Chelsea, and I told them, I said, if I ever get my hand on that building, it's going to be named after the three of us. So now McDonough 19 is the Tate, Etienne, and Prevost Interpretive Center. And this building is there to tell our history.
Okay, I like to say something that was by John Lewis. He said, do the right thing when you see something that is not right, not just, not fair. You are morally obligated to say something or to do something. Get into trouble. Get into good trouble.
We got in good trouble.
Yes. And that's exactly what multimedia activist Deidre Meredith has done for us. It's because of her dedication and work that we've been surrounded by all the professionals in film, photography, fashion and styling, marketing, and education. Deidre and her colleagues from Comcast, NBC Universal set the record straight. And because of that, we landed our first national television network interview on the Today Show with Rahima Ellis. And that has started all this that's been happening to us since 2018. And for that, I thank you. And that's Deidre right there with the red coat on.
Well, it's taken some time, but we are truly blessed and honored to have you on this stage telling your story, telling your testimony to us in 2024. Know that we will not forget your story and what you've lived through. We will be motivated and inspired by the struggle that you've endured to continue to work to ensure equal educational opportunity for students today. We're here to mark the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, but I want to close by also wishing you both a very happy birthday.
Thank you. Can I say one more thing? Can I say one more thing? Absolutely. And because of what we went through, Tessie Leon and I are sisters for life.
I want to thank the AAG and especially Ms. Tate and Ms. Etienne for those moving remarks. I know that we were all inspired by their stories, so thank you for sharing them with us. We will close today's event with a special presentation by the AAG, but before we get to that, I'm delighted to turn the stage over to our next speaker, Domestic Policy Advisor to President Biden, Neera Tanden, who leads the Domestic Policy Council at the White House. Thank you so much for joining us. Please join me in welcoming Neera Tanden.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can do better. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really an incredible honor to be here today. It's an incredible honor to be here to basically honor the 70th anniversary, but I also just want to say it's really a privilege to be here with Leona Tate and Gail Etienne. And I was incredibly moved by your stories, and I do want to say I think you're absolutely right. We all have to keep remembering, not just remember, but keep remembering the true history, because unless we keep remembering that true history will repeat itself, and all that fighting will be for naught. So it is really our responsibility today to keep your stories in our memory, in our thinking as we fight to move forward. So thank you very much. And I'm also just really happy to be here with Kristen Clark, who is a phenomenal champion for civil rights in the administration, and we are lucky to have her as well. She is a fierce advocate, and we are really grateful. So I just want to say a few words here. I'm the President's Domestic Policy Advisor and oversee the Domestic Policy Council. And we have one of our most significant areas of work is in racial justice and civil rights. Because core to this administration, and really from the beginning through today, is our focus on racial equity. And that is because we know that we are still in a fight on these issues. 70 years after the Brown decision, we can actually see in the history of Brown how much we still are in this fight. Because then we had a Supreme Court that really did see as part of its identity that its role was to be a champion for justice. And I won't comment on the current court, but it is nice to have a court that is actually thinking about expanding justice instead of contracting it. But even in the history of the last several decades with Brown, we have seen a big difference between moments and time where the government is intentionally promoting integration and other times where the courts have dismantled our abilities to tackle integration and really made it so that we are much less intentional in our actions about integration. And we see the results, which is when the tools are taken away or undermined by the courts, then it is just harder to achieve these goals. Why? Because the status quo itself does not generally perpetuate justice. And this is why this is really a central lesson to us in the administration, and why the president, as one of his first executive orders, issued his first EO on equity in federal government and ensuring that we are driving advancing racial equity and equity overall. And last year, he issued a second EO on this topic to ensure that every federal agency is driving forward on racial equity and really trying to undo the historic challenges we've seen in some of our agencies. And the reason why I bring this up is because I do think there's so much discourse about today about whether we've already reached the promised land or how efforts to address desegregation are actually promulgating problems with race themselves, which is really an upside-down way to think about the world. And it is a reminder that our work needs to have the focus of leaders, needs the intention of policy to drive real results. And I am grateful for the examples here today of young people driving results, young people trying to recognize the importance of integration. And fundamentally, this is not just for all of us to feel good, but we know schools that are integrated deliver better results for all students. And that is what the promise of Brown is, true opportunity for all students. And really that means true opportunity for all Americans in their future. I know that the president is fighting for that vision and really fighting against those who would tear this notion of diversity down. But I will say it is up to all of us to on this day, on the anniversary of Brown, to recommit to ensuring true opportunity for all Americans. That is central to our work in the Domestic Policy Council. I am very privileged to work with the Justice Department and the Education Department on these issues. Our team works very closely together because we all have the president's vision focused in front of us, which is to ensure that this country represents all of us. We expand opportunity for all of us. We ensure each child has real opportunity, and that this country is for all of us, not just some of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Neera Tanden for joining us this afternoon. We are now nearing the end of our program. But before we close out, I want to rewind the clock to when Leona Tate and Gail Etienne were just 15 years old. Around that time, there was a lawyer who was starting off his career at the Justice Department named Franz Marshall. Franz Marshall has spent the last 55 years working tirelessly to open the schoolhouse door to all children in our country. Over the course of his career, Franz has represented the United States in hundreds of desegregation cases. Through his work, Franz has given voice to children and parents in communities throughout the United States, from Native Americans in the Four Corners to African Americans in the Louisiana Bayou. He has shaped the legal landscape and cleared paths to a better life for countless students. He has also fiercely embodied an essential founding mission of the Civil Rights Division to dismantle obstacles to opportunity and success in America's public schools. Franz has led litigation teams in desegregation cases that stretch from Louisiana to Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, and Georgia. His teams have obtained relief, including settlement agreements and consent decrees that have remedied the underrepresentation of Black students in gifted and talented programs, desegregated school faculties by eliminating discriminatory roadblocks to hiring Black teachers and administrators, and ended discriminatory discipline practices that disproportionately harm students of color. Franz has also led the division's work on integration and equity in higher education, serving as lead counsel in each of the United States' landmark cases to desegregate state higher education systems. The relationships that Franz has built as a warrior of Brown with federal judges and opposing counsel, teachers, students, other leaders in the fight for desegregation and equal opportunity, and above all, with us, his colleagues at the Department of Justice, have left a deep and lasting imprint. They are a testament to Franz's enduring and immeasurable contributions to the Justice Department's long-standing school desegregation efforts. Please join me in thanking and recognizing the great Franz Marshall. This marks the end of our special commemoration of the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. I hope that you all leave here inspired by the stories that you heard today, and most of all, leave here prepared to carry forth the torch of these two extraordinary women.